coming in at just 335 words in the original Greek, and only 25 verses is Paul's letter to Philemon. Paul's major works, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, etc., are letters to congregations or letters to multiple congregations. Most of his letters are written to congregations that he established. He talked to people about Jesus in those locations. People got excited about Jesus, and small communities of people became followers of Jesus, forming churches. Paul would then write letters to them to provide encouragement or correction where needed. The letter to Philemon is different in that it is written to one person. His name is Philemon. It's also a letter which addresses a specific issue, a predicament in Philemon's household that Paul was trying to influence. Paul and Philemon would have been each intimately familiar with the predicament at hand. And so Paul doesn't lay the whole thing out for us. It's kind of clear when you read the letter that Paul wasn't expecting anyone to read this letter except Philemon and perhaps the people in his household. Because Paul doesn't exhaustively explain the situation, because Philemon didn't need him to, and because Paul probably wasn't expecting us to be eavesdropping in on this letter 2,000 years later, we have to sort of read between the lines to figure out what was going on. In this video, I want to lay out what seems to be the problem that Paul is trying to speak to. So, Philemon is Christian. He's a Christian from Colossae, which we learn from the letter to the Colossians, and it appears that the church met in his home for worship and fellowship. In the early part of the letter, Paul extols the faith and virtue of Philemon and the love and faithfulness that you have toward the Lord Jesus and toward all the holy ones. So, Philemon is a prominent Christian in good standing, intimately familiar to the Apostle Paul, and is a principal contributor to the church that meets in his home. Philemon is also a slave owner, and one of his slaves is named Onesimus. Onesimus is an incredibly common slave name. When slaves had children, they did not have the right to name them. Rather, their master named them. Onesimus means useful. And so slave masters would name slave children born in their households Onesimus because they hoped that one day they would be useful to them. Now, Onesimus appears to have gotten into some trouble. We don't get any details on this, but apparently it's something big enough that Onesimus ran away from Philemon's household and ran to Paul. There's a good argument to be made that the trouble has to do with money, because in the letter, Paul tells Philemon if he in any way has wronged you or is indebted to you, reckon it to me. I, Paul, have written it with my own hand. I will repay. When we say that Paul wrote his letters. He actually dictated them to someone else who wrote them down for him. Here, in this case, Paul takes the pen out of the scribe's hand and writes, "I will repay." Would there have been reason to do this were the situation not about money? Probably not. Perhaps Onesimus had been put in charge of a sum of money and lost it. We know, of course, that ancient slaves could be made responsible for large amounts of money and resources. Perhaps Onesimus had broken something of value. Maybe he had taken something of value. Maybe some tragedy struck while Onesimus was supposed to be in charge. Whatever it was a big deal. A big enough deal that Onesimus tracked down Paul, who was imprisoned at the moment, and a big enough deal that the most important apostle in the ancient world took the time to write a letter on his behalf. A slave had messed up big time, and therefore the slave would have been subject to the wrath of his master, which could have meant severe punishment or even death to the slave. Assumably, Onesimus sought out Paul because he thought that Paul had the kind of stature that he could actually intervene on his behalf. Onesimus would have had zero legal recourse. There was no arbitrator who served as a middleman in a dispute between a slave and a master. The slave was the master's property. The master could do with the slave as the master saw fit. Except in this case, the slave master was also a Christian, and as a Christian, Philemon was beholden to the spiritual counsel of the Apostle Paul. We don't actually know if Onesimus was a Christian to begin with, but as of the writing of this letter, it appears that he is. For Paul wants to send Onesimus back to Philemon as a beloved brother. So, Paul writes the letter. He sends Onesimus back to Philemon with the letter in hand. Of course, this is a risk. Onesimus would have certainly been nervous. Again, Philemon would probably listen to Paul, but there was no guarantee. Philemon had no legal or cultural obligation to abide by the direction of a third party in the matter of a dispute with a slave. Paul writes, "For perhaps it is for this reason that he departed for an hour, so that in return you might have him for the age, no longer as a slave, but something beyond a slave, a beloved brother, to me especially, but how much more so to you, both in flesh and in the Lord. Therefore, if you hold me to be a companion, welcome him as you would me." Paul is very, very good. This is diplomat level good. Paul tells Philemon in no uncertain terms that Onesimus is important to Paul, and that if Philemon follows Paul's counsel, Onesimus could become a brother to him as well. And Paul tells Philemon to treat Onesimus as he would treat Paul. "I write to you confident of your compliance, knowing that you will do even more than I say. At the same time, moreover, prepare lodging for me, for I hope that by your prayers I shall be graciously granted to you." I mean, wow, right? I'm confident that you're going to do what I tell you to do, and I'm going to be swinging by soon to check in on you. He's good. Now, that's all we get. We don't get a second Philemon. We don't get a follow-up letter. We don't know if Philemon takes Paul's instructions under advisement or whether he comes down hard on Onesimus. But this letter does tell a lot about the situation of slaves in the ancient world and in the ancient church, which we'll get to in the next session.